Hey guys, Ted here. Hey, I want to talk for a little bit about what I think is going to solve or will solve just about 99% of the problems that afflict the world today. And that is a thing called responsibility. And I say that, and this is now, Friday the 20th, I believe, of August. And I must say I expected the administration to start trying to blame everyone else for the debacle in Afghanistan. I'm glad to see many people are beginning to push back and say that this is not an intelligence failure, that we did tell you that this was going to happen, that, a person of Mr. Biden's he's been in politics since he was about 28 years old, and he was elected to the Senate right before his 30th birthday. So somebody of your considerable, more than 50 years of experience in politics and foreign affairs, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee many years ago as well. Anyone who is an observer of Afghanistan, especially anybody who spent significant time in government, could see what would happen when the United States withdrew logistic, intelligence, and political support from the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces. Keep in mind, Brown University, I believe it is, they've done a project and they've estimated, I want to say since 2014, more than 65,000 Afghan military and security personnel died fighting the Taliban. The reason they collapsed was because they believed that we no longer had their back. And I'm not saying they're perfect, I promise you that. But I do think that this administration is complicit. And I'm disappointment, I shouldn't say disappointment, I'll say this. There's a saying in Russian that the fish rots from the head down. Accountability begins at the top. And if there should be accountability, which I believe there should be, I think some resignations and firings are definitely in order at the senior most levels of this administration. The other thing I'll say is that if this administration and this government cannot get its act together and focus on the right things instead of, we're focusing on things like diversity and equity, which I've always found at the deck plate level really pull people apart. Whereas at the senior levels of government and the military, it's been my experience that most of the people up there are usually white, mostly dudes, upper class and educated at Ivy Leagues or the service academies. And I'm not bagging service academy people or Ivy Leaguers, but don't lecture me about equity, inclusion, and diversity when you yourself live in an incredibly insular environment. And so I think we need to focus more on what's the reality of the deck plate. The deck plate, there's cohesion. At the deck plate, there's teamwork, there's fraternity, brotherhood, sorority. I've certainly shared a number of meals and canteens with people who were really, really different from Ted. And so it really angers me that it seemed like the military was our senior leaders were really focused on that and not focused on more immediate things. And now we see the catastrophic consequences of that in Afghanistan. But let's talk about responsibility. 3 things happened today. I saw 3 quotes, and they kind of made me say, you know what, I need to do this video. Well, actually, one happened yesterday. I was talking to a lady at work, and she said, we are fighting and dying overseas for freedoms that we are losing here in America. And as she said this, I noticed her voice kind of became hushed, even though we were outside. Do you notice a lot of Americans these days are kind of doing this because they're a little scared to say things? They're scared to offend somebody. They know that there's a very real possibility that for some people there are going to be dire professional consequences or personal consequences if they say something that is insensitive or hurtful, that shows a lack of caring or concern, even if you did it like 20, 30 years ago. And so that was one thing that really struck me. And then today, as I was driving around, the churches around here usually have billboards or something up, and I saw one as I went by a synagogue, and it said, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And then the last one I saw that really, really drove it home to me was that even a broken tree can bear good fruit. And that was at a Pentecostal church. So let's talk a little bit about responsibility, because I think responsibility is something we have gotten so far away from in Western civilization, Western society. And taking responsibility is a good thing. We used to actually reward people for taking responsibility. It was considered, back in the day, it was in the Victorian era, it was the manly thing to do, is take responsibility. Dueling, okay, I'm not advocating dueling, But quite often dueling was considered, especially for people like Andrew Jackson, well, many of those duels he got into was because the reason he did it was because he was defending his wife's honor. Your family, your wife, they are your responsibility as a man. Not only to protect them and care for them and provide for them, but also to defend their honor. So politically, and I think this is the thing, is politically I think our leaders are so concerned, they're more concerned about being correct than being right. They want to make sure they push the right narrative, this narrative of, intelligence failed us, or this narrative of, we are, this and that, something else. I mean, even every administration does it. If President Trump didn't like what the news media was saying, it's fake news. Well, in some ways, you need to sometimes, some of that was true. And I think President Trump could have done a much better job rather than, bashing it, had he confronted it and dispelled the fake news. He sent some pretty incompetent people out to do his bidding for him. People such as Matt Gaetz. And we're going to talk about you, Matt. So let's talk about responsibility. The Bay of Pigs, right? 1961. Kennedy administration comes into office January 1961. They take over a plan from the Eisenhower administration to use Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and to overthrow the Castro regime. Well, the Kennedy administration significantly changes that plan. They move the landing site to the Bay of Pigs, which is isolated. There are littoral conditions there that are not conducive to an amphibious landing. And then also during the actual landing, the Kennedy administration withdrew air support, withdrew logistic support, and sadly, so many of those men were just cut down on those beaches, and many of them wound up spending more than a year, I believe, in Cuban prisons. I actually knew a man, Robert De Verona, who lived here in Pensacola. He had actually been at the Bay of Pigs. He was about 18 years old. Something I'll say about that. The Kennedy administration, the Kennedy administration was a groupthink. We have a bunch of men here, Ivy Leaguers, cut from the same cloth. And they're smart, right? And this plan, this is who we are, this is the plan, and it's going to work. And if you read a book called The Best and the Brightest, it talks a lot about this kind of group thing. But to his credit, President Kennedy owned it. He owned the Bay of Pigs. He owned the aftermath. The saying that victory has 100 fathers, or victory has 1,000 fathers but defeats an orphan. I don't think President Kennedy coined that term, but he certainly used it after the Bay of Pigs. And his administration survived. And we don't remember President Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs. We remember him for things such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or other things, like the moonshot. Something Mr. De Verona told me, though, that I thought was fascinating was that he said when he was imprisoned in Cuba, how he could never understand why people wore Che Guevara shirts. Because Che Guevara and his people and his ilk, the Castro regime, tortured people, beat them to death, dismembered bodies, executed people, would round up homosexuals and torture them publicly so everybody could hear them scream and die. And I find that interesting because we have people walking around these days who wear Che Guevara shirts, and they don't have any sense of understanding. They have no responsibility. Our system has not properly educated them. And that's what I want to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about education. When I was a teenager, I was at high school here in Florida, Pensacola, actually north of Pensacola, out in the boonies. And I didn't think it was, why do I need to study English? Why do I need to study grammar and all this other stuff, and it's stupid. And I had a teacher named Orestine Wills, Miss Wills. I love Miss Wills. She's black, and she started teaching in segregated schools back in the 50s. And she told me one day, she said, as long as you talk like you do, no matter how smart you are, if you don't learn how to talk properly, use good English, good diction, good grammar, all you are to people is a dumb redneck. Whew. To this day, that's been almost 35 years ago, I still remember that. And it lit a fire under my butt that made me go on to do things, go on to learn English really well, to do well in the TSWE, the Test of Standard Written English, to read the dictionary multiple times. And I still, to this day, I've seen Miss Wills many times, and I still love her dearly for that, because she not only taught me in high school, but also college. And she was always on me to get an education and to become a truly educated and kind of liberal thinking person. Now, I want to ask you, was that her responsibility as a teacher to tell me that? That was back in the 90s. Now, today, would a teacher tell that to a student? See, that's what political correctness, that's what being woke, that's what being sensitive does, is it silences some of the best things about our society, about taking responsibility for one's future. Or as a teacher, her responsibility was to educate me. And sometimes, trust me, that education can be rather unpleasant, but it's responsible. People need that in order to mature and develop. The other thing I would ask is this, let me ask you, if, let's say, okay, Miss Wills is black, I'm white. Now flip the script. If a white teacher said that to a black student, even though it's correct for anyone, regardless of color, how would that go today? Who's the real victim of this failure to take responsibility in our society? Is it the people who already have privilege and status and power, or is it the people who have merit, who can rise in our society? And so I ask you to think about that, and then I just want to touch on a few little quick stories, and then I'll wrap it up very quickly because I don't want to go over 20 minutes. Talk about the Bay of Pigs. Talk about President Kennedy owning the failure at the Bay of Pigs. Understanding that, hey, we changed the plan, we messed it up, and this probably wasn't a good plan to begin with, but we did make it worse, and we failed to execute even those things we committed to do for the Cuban exiles. The 2506, that was the unit that went in. There's, great leaders can survive this. Great leaders take responsibility, and good leaders who take responsibility become great leaders. I once asked a mentor of mine when he was a captain, he's now a 2-star admiral, I asked him, how do you do this? And he said, well, I kind of wing it. But then what I realized, the more I was around him and worked for him, that his competence was, the foundation of his competence was his extraordinary character. The fact that he took responsibility. The fact that he took responsibility to develop himself as well. And that he listened to people. And he understood his shortcomings, and he overcame those. And he was willing to bring in help and honesty to do so. Now imagine if maybe recent presidents had that attitude. But let's talk a little bit about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, during World War I think he was First Lord of the Admiralty, or First Sea Lord or something. Basically, it was like the British equivalent of the Secretary of the Navy. And he advocated for the Gallipoli campaign. And the Gallipoli campaign was supposed to knock Turkey out of the war, bring a quick end to this stalemate in Europe. And it failed. And it killed lots of British personnel, killed a lot of Australians and New Zealanders. I think Anzac Day is either the date that they landed at Gallipoli or it has some tie. I can't, pardon my lack of memory here. But the reason I mention that is Churchill resigned from the government after that. And he actually went into the regular army and served in World War I. And he returned to politics after the humiliation of Gallipoli, and that haunted him for decades. He was remembered as incompetent, as the butcher of Gallipoli, as a man whose mistake cost thousands of lives wastefully. But Churchill survived this. He took responsibility. He resigned. He went to the battlefields of France. He put skin in the game. During World War II, when Churchill was Prime Minister, Churchill, that kind of responsibility made Churchill understand the need to speak out, and he was very reluctant to approve any type of amphibious operation. When the Allies landed at Dieppe, mostly Canadian and British soldiers, and it failed in 1942. Churchill, this hurt. But the lessons learned at Dieppe were applied to another amphibious landing about 2 years later at a place called Normandy. And that succeeded. Churchill took responsibility. Even a broken tree can bear good fruit. And it can heal. Talk about British personnel, British people. In 1963, the British Secretary of State for War, kind of their Secretary of Defense, was a man named John Profumo. And Profumo was in his 40s back in 1960, 61, and he met a 19-year-old young lady named Christine Keeler. I think she was a prostitute, kind of a very high-end call girl. And he had a relationship with her. There were some other people involved. There were allegations of all kinds of extramarital affairs, drugs, you name it. Well, Christine Keeler was also the mistress of the Soviet naval attaché in the United Kingdom. Profumo lied about the affair, and he lied to official inquiries. And when he was caught, because he had lied, the honorable thing for him to do, because he no longer enjoyed the trust of the British people or the Prime Minister, and certainly we could also assume the Queen, the honorable thing for him to do and the responsible thing for him to do, because of his office and who he was, and as a man, he resigned. He resigned to fix his marriage. He resigned to redeem himself. And subsequently, later in life, because of some of the work he did, he was knighted. And he died. Most people had a positive understanding of Profumo after that. He survived that scandal. Churchill, Profumo, and I want to ask you, think about I would say Matt Gaetz, okay? I just can't help it. I live here in Florida District 1. I'm embarrassed by this man. And if the allegations against him are true, or if there's any validity to them, well, first of all, he owes an explanation to everybody. To us, the people he represents, the people who've entrusted him to represent our best interests, our values in Washington, D.C. The second thing is that if we are not his primary concern, if his own self-interest or preservation or his appetites are greater than his care for us and his concern for our values and our needs, he needs to resign. That's what honor dictates. That's in the best interest of this district. Now apply this to the Biden administration. Apply this to the Trump administration. Apply this to any aspect of our society. People need to take responsibility. It is hard. It is hard. But when people take responsibility, taking responsibility is power. There's a form of power in that. I used to get angry at politics. I used to get angry at many things. And then one day I realized, I just have to get active. That's why I do these YouTube videos. This is cathartic for me. Now, I know that people will criticize. I know that, when you take responsibility, when you put yourself out there, you do accept some risk. But we are at the point in our society where we are because I think throughout our society, at all levels, as individuals, as parents, as anything, as institutions, we have failed to take responsibility. The Catholic Church, when people like Cardinal Law can stand up and be like, well, this and that. No, he failed to take responsibility. Cardinal McCarrick, the former, he's now been laicized. I cannot believe that the Catholic Church had the hierarchy in the United States and Rome. We're completely caught off guard by that, by the fact that this man was a sexual predator. They failed to take responsibility. With what's happened in Afghanistan, with what is happening on our streets, there's been a failure to take responsibility. What is happening in the family, especially the fact that significant populations in the United States of young men don't take responsibility to be good fathers and husbands. We are destroying the very sinews of civilized life. Responsibility matters in a free society. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. I appreciate your time listening to this. I just felt compelled to say these things today. As always, please feel free to comment. I would like to do a future video about Huntington and the clash of civilizations and foreign policy. But I think that now we're seeing, if anything good comes from all these experiences and all these recent events, it's the fact that we are all awakening and realizing that we own this, we have to take responsibility. We have to scrutinize, challenge, confront those who make decisions on our behalf. Thank you so much.